Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me. The Durham Report has finally been released after years of waiting for this document, after millions of dollars spent. What did we learn? Well, we learned what we already knew, right? That the alphabet agencies are politically corrupt, that they've been weaponized to target political opponents, that the whole thing was a ruse, never should have started to begin with. However, the report is largely meaningless because guess what? Not a single person responsible is going to be held accountable. This is the highest levels of the abuses of power that we've witnessed in quite some time, and nobody's going to be held accountable. Nobody has been, nobody will be. And that's the real story here. It shows how powerful the swamp really is, how they protect their own, how you could expose all this corruption. You could expose how the agencies are being weaponized, and yet nothing gets done about it. There's no movement to reduce the power of these agencies, to reform these agencies, to slash the funding of these agencies. When these agencies prove that they can't be trusted, we have to do something. But nothing is getting done, and there's very little outrage. Now, I understand why the mainstream press isn't posting this all over the place, because they were complicit. They were complicit in helping a false narrative being pushed on the American people. You want to talk about election interference? Well, here you go. Here's election interference in the highest order. And again, people should be outraged about this. Unfortunately, we are so ideologically warped. We're in our ideological bubbles that there are so many that don't care. They'll care when it turns against them, because the biggest threat to this republic is those that believe that they are the guardians of democracy, that they get to pick and choose who our representatives are, that they get to pick and choose who is qualified for office and who isn't qualified for office, that they get to pick and choose who they want to lead this country. That's the biggest threat. When you have these alphabet agencies pushing an agenda, we got a big problem in this country. And sadly, there is no will to do anything about it. That's why the United States seems like a sinking ship right now. It's why we seem to be entering the banana republic status. It really is disgraceful. And it's not just with the Durham Report. I mean, I want my $40 million back, my taxpayer money that went to the Mueller investigation. That was a complete fraud. I want to see people criminally prosecuted for lying to the FISA court, for manipulating evidence, for lying to the American people, for lying to Congress. It really is ridiculous. And it's not just with this, it's with everything. Okay, we see Title 42, which restricted entry into the United States in response to the pandemic. It's now been lifted. We are witnessing this catastrophic surge like we've never seen before. But even before Title 42 was lifted, this administration has made it clear that they want an open border policy. Since there has been a sharp increase of people attempting to enter the United States, the situation is only getting worse. And at what cost? What is the purpose of this? Why aren't we securing the border? It's not really that complicated. This crisis is a direct result of President Biden's open border policies, its self-inflicted wounds. His administration has failed in its duty to protect American citizens, to protect you out there. And the consequences are dire. Not only is the influx overwhelming our border control resources, it's creating significant burdens in communities across the country. Obviously Texas and Arizona are getting slammed. Local authorities are struggling to cope with the surge. We have shelters that are over 400% capacity. We're witnessing cities throughout the United States struggling. These are the same cities that declared themselves sanctuary cities. Now they're all upset. They're all upset. They're lashing out because they are directly feeling the effects of the problems that open borders creates. It's easy to be a public virtue signaler, preaching your own self-righteousness. But sooner or later, reality kicks in. And it's not so easy then, once reality kicks in. This crisis is not a logistical problem. It's also a humanitarian one. We have a situation where everyone's lives are at risk. You have the Border Patrol agents that go out day in, day out, doing their job under conditions that you can't even possibly imagine, where they have no support from the leadership. Their lives are at risk. You have the American people who are already living in struggling communities where the infrastructure has collapsed, communities where the education system has failed. They have to bear the brunt of this problem. Even the illegal immigrants themselves taking this journey, their lives are at risk as well. You know, for all the moral holy warriors out there preaching their own self-righteousness, how many people have died on the border? How many have died on this journey? You'll never hear about that. They won't talk about that because they don't care about people. What they care about is that they could pat themselves on the back. They look in the mirror. They're so narcissistic and they believe that they are morally superior to everyone else. It doesn't matter the damage and the destruction they're causing. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the impact of this crisis on the American people. We'll delve into how many public officials have abdicated their responsibilities and how Americans are the ones suffering under these policies. I want to talk about how these officials have been in their oath of protecting the United States. A lot of these officials, they're not being straight with the American people. In the media industrial complex, they're not calling them out. They're the ones that are assisting them in a certain narrative that's being pushed out there. So sit tight. We're going to dive into the catastrophe and the effect it's having on our communities. And sadly, this is only going to continue until we get responsible leadership in place. Before I jump in, make sure you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. Also visit the P.A.S. Report website, PASreport.com. From there, you can check out latest interviews, latest articles, whatever you want to do on it. Now, getting to today, last week I talked about how the American identity, the idea of America, how it's being thwarted, how it's being disregarded, how there's an active approach to undermine what America is really about and the American identity. And so this ties into it because over the weekend, President Biden was giving a commencement address to students at a historically black college. And here is what your uniter-in-chief had to say.
To stand up against the poison of white supremacy, as I did my inaugural address, to single out as the most dangerous terrorist threat to our homeland is white supremacy. And I'm not saying this because I'm at a black HBCU. I say it wherever I go.
The president should be ashamed of himself. What he said is disgraceful. And not for nothing, this is the president. A lot of people voted. They didn't like President Trump because they felt President Trump was too divisive, that President Trump was alienating people and he was mean. Not for nothing. But Joe Biden, President Biden, is nasty. He constantly uses race to divide and pit us against each other. He constantly uses race to draw a wedge, to scare people. He's not a uniter-in-chief. He should be thrown out of office for the bum that he really is, mooching off the taxpayers for decades. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that white supremacy is worse today than it was 120 years ago. Not for nothing, but at the turn of the 20th century, we had a population of 128 million people. The Ku Klux Klan had membership rankings of 4 million people. Today, we're a country of over 330 million people. And how many people belong to the hate groups? The Southern Poverty Law Center, and I'm using their numbers because the left always touts their numbers, estimates that between 4,500 to 6,500 Americans engage in white supremacist organization, whether it's KKK or neo-Nazi groups. Now, I'm not diminishing white supremacy. It's abhorrent. It should be called out. It should be stopped. But I'm tired of this administration saying that white supremacy is the biggest threat to the republic, that it's the biggest threat of domestic terrorism. That is a lie. If these white supremacist organizations were so organized, well, what is their organizations? What are the names of these organizations? What's the command and control structure? What are their operational capabilities? Why don't we know who the people are, who the senior leadership is? You know, I always say, I compare it always to the mob, because when it comes to the mob, the government will put out an entire hierarchy. Who's the mob boss? What's the hierarchy like? Who's the underboss? Who are the capos? Who are the soldiers? They put all that out there. Same thing holds true of terrorist organizations. So why hasn't the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, if white supremacy really is the gravest threat that this nation faces, then why haven't they put out anything like that for these white supremacist organizations? Why don't they call them out by the group's names? Why don't we make Americans more aware? And it's because it's not the biggest threat. It's a fraud being perpetrated on the American people. Hate groups need to be stopped. They need to be marginalized. We have to push back against them. We can't allow anti-Semitism. We can't allow racism. But America is not a racist country. The overwhelming majority of Americans are good, honest, and decent people. And I'm not going to let this fool make it as if the American people, even a large portion of the American people, are racist or bigoted or anything like that. We now live in the most open and tolerant times that we've ever witnessed in the history of humanity. We are the only country the only country where you have all these different peoples coming together and coexisting well together. And then you have this fraud of a Homeland Security Secretary, one of the biggest morons within government, who should be impeached and removed from office because he has failed in his responsibilities. He is someone that just sits there and pushes what the president is saying. Take a listen.
The president yesterday at his commencement address for the Howard University graduates called white supremacy the major domestic terror threat in this country. Is that correct?
It tragically is. In the terrorism context, domestic violent extremism is our greatest threat right now. Individuals are driven to violence because of ideologies of hate, anti-government sentiments, false narratives, personal grievances, and the like. And regrettably, we have seen a rise in white supremacy.
These are the people that peddle on race. These are the people that promote hate. That's what they're doing. And as Mayorkas is going out there doing these interviews, and he's saying that white supremacy is the greatest threat that the country faces. Well, no, there's actually a lot bigger threats, right? We see China making moves in the international community, challenging the United States supremacy on the international world stage. We see the United States consistently getting weaker on the international world stage, where multiple countries, including countries that are aligned with us, are actually moving away from us. We see the dollar being challenged on all fronts. We see an economic disaster, a catastrophe happening. We see a surge in major crime in the inner cities, violent crimes, and a lot of it is random. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's not like the gang wars that existed in the 70s and 80s. This is just ordinary people, and yet we have officials that will treat someone like Daniel Perry as a criminal, and yet the person that's the victimizer, the perpetrator, is the one that is now the victim. It's so bizarre. And then you look at it and you see this open border policy and this complete disregard for the American people. And that's what I want to touch on, because something happened over the weekend that is truly disgusting, and it really is remarkable. It speaks volumes about where we are as a country. So we're going to take a quick break. When we get back, I want to talk about something that every American should be outraged about. Shouldn't matter what your political ideology is. So hang tight. We'll be right back. P.A.S. report listeners, hurricane season is almost here, and the time to prepare is right now, not when the hurricane hits. When Hurricane Ida hit the Gulf Coast, it destroyed countless homes and left many without access to food and clean water. Millions lost power, some for weeks. The floods that followed the hurricane washed out roads, made it impossible for grocery stores to restock their shelves. Families were desperate. They were waiting for help that was slow to arrive. But what if you didn't have to rely on FEMA to provide for your family during a crisis? The answer is simple. Be prepared with emergency food kits from 4 Patriots. Their long-lasting and delicious food options are specifically designed to provide you and your loved ones with the sustenance you need when you need it most. And these food kits are hand-packed in the USA, last up to 25 years, compact inside covert storage totes, include a wide variety of delicious breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, and they're backed by thousands of 5-star customer reviews. 4 Patriots survival food is not just for natural disasters. In today's world of uncertain supply chains and unpredictable emergencies, it's more important than ever to have a backup plan. Whether it's temporary power outage, a winter blizzard, rising food costs, you can rest easy knowing that you have a reliable source of food to see you through. And right now, you go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the emergency food supply kits that are designed to last up to 25 years. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase of 4 Patriots survival food. Welcome back, everyone. So now what I want to talk about is how you were treated better as a non-citizen than a citizen in this country. And it's an intentional thing, right? They're trying to devalue what citizenship really means. Again, it goes back to what I talked about last week, this idea of global citizenship that they want to push, the idea that the place you're born in, citizenship is essentially an accident by birth. It's a complete fraud, but that's what they're pushing out there. So I remember back during the Obama administration, you had Secretary Jay Johnson said that if we have 1,000 border encounters a day, that our Border Patrol is stretched to the brink, that it can't sustain that level of activity. Well, today, how many do we have? We have thousands, 6 to 10,000 a day crossing over our border. There are some estimates that it's going to go up from 10,000 up to possibly 16 or 17,000 per day. What country can sustain that? It is remarkable when you think about the destruction that these policies are going to cause. Not for nothing. Again, I told you, If you're an American citizen, you are getting shafted. You are the one that's being penalized. How can that be, Professor Giordano? What's happening? Well, there's a couple things going on. When people take this journey to the United States, they're not coming with tens of thousands of dollars in their bank accounts where they're going to be able to sustain themselves. They don't have that kind of money. And so when they get here, they come broke and they don't have anything. And so they get government, they're going to get a government issued phone. They're going to get government subsidies. They're going to be put up in hotels. How many of you out there are being put up in hotels? How many? Children coming up here. We are a humane nation, so we're going to provide them with an education. We're going to provide them with a level of health care. They're going to be provided with food stamps. How much is this costing the American taxpayer? Has anyone asked that question? Well, there are estimates out there. And the estimates are that it's going to cost between $90 to $180 billion a year. 90 to 180 billion. I want you to think about that number for a minute, because this is your taxpayer money. That's insane. That's more than the Department of Transportation. It's more than Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Labor. I mean, think about the numbers that we're talking about. Think about the impact that it has. It really shows you that this is out of control. And it just gets worse. Over the weekend, you had veterans, homeless veterans being kicked out of shelter to make way for the illegal immigrants. What planet are we on? These are people that have put their lives on the line in the name and in defense of this country. These are veterans that did a job that most couldn't fathom. The traumas that they faced on the battlefield are a big cause of why they're homeless today, and yet they were thrown out to make room for illegal immigrants. Again, rack that in your brain for a little bit. Now, why did they do this? Well, apparently, when it comes to reimbursement rates, you only get reimbursed $88 for a homeless veteran, but you'll be reimbursed $200 for an illegal immigrant. Why? I mean, our veterans, we need to take care of them. How many Americans, how many veterans are suffering from injuries they received during warfare, from the emotional and mental scars that they carry around with them daily? And yet we just throw them to the curb. What has happened to our country? What have they done? And it doesn't end there. The true cost of this crisis is often overlooked. And we have to address this financial, the social, the economic consequences of illegal immigration. See, illegal immigrants, they're often going to go to already struggling communities where crime rates are high, infrastructure is failing, schools failing, basic resources stretched thin, puts additional strain on these communities. We see a decline in the quality of life in these communities. And there's little common sense out there, right? So we know our electrical grid capacity is already stretched to the brink. Our grids are old and outdated. They're at high risk of failure. So this is a serious concern, especially in New York, where over 60,000 migrants have been placed since last spring. And the lifting of Title 42 is certainly going to make that even worse. So now they have 60,000 individuals that are now drawing off the grid system. How much does that impact it? You know, people don't look at those issues. We're already warned that, when temperatures hit over 90, there may be rolling blackouts in a number of states. When it comes to education, again, it's the taxpayer money that's funding all this. We are a humane nation, and so we're going to educate children that come here regardless of immigration status. However, the costs are staggering. New York State, one state, spends an average of $25,139 per student per year. New York City, it's more than $37,000 a year. Now, New York State is not your picture of fiscal health out there. Our total debt and unfunded liabilities is insane. Officials are completely irresponsible when they're spending our money. But we saw this firsthand. We saw it in 2014. The United States faced an unprecedented wave of children crossing the border. New York State received the second highest rate of the settlement, right behind California. Long Island schools were quickly overwhelmed. They didn't have enough teachers for the classrooms. They didn't have enough seats in the classrooms. They couldn't meet the demand. The overcrowding was staggering, and it creates a number of issues, including fire and safety hazards. Well, the 2014 numbers dwarf today's crisis, and what we're seeing, the surge of illegal immigrant students, it puts a strain on resources as well. You have to hire more ELA specialists. You have to redirect money from other programs to fund that. It obviously is going to negatively impact the overall quality of education for all students, including American citizens and legal permanent residents. Then you look at the bonehead idea, well, we're going to send some of them to college on the taxpayer dime. Well, what about the American people? Why do American students have to graduate with enormous student debt burdens? And yet, if you come into this country illegally, you're going to get your tuition paid for. When you look at financial aid, the Biden administration working to relax the rules surrounding financial aid. Financial aid, you qualify for it if you're under a certain income threshold, that the government will give you the Pell Grant in order to pay for some of your education. There's only a limited amount of money in the pot. So when more and more people are applying, the awards are going to get reduced. And that's what you're seeing across the board. And that same thing holds true for all programs out there. The limited money, the more people that apply, the reduced benefit you're going to get. But we're going to spend $400 a night in hotel rooms for these people. Imagine that. Well, the communities are starting to wake up. They're starting to notice. Here's a clip from Chicago of community members being outraged at what's taking place. Take a listen.
It is a slap in the face that we as citizens of the United States of America do not have the resources and support, but you're going to bring people who are not citizens here in our community, in our buildings that we pay taxes for, that you took away from us. Yeah. That is completely unacceptable. We are in a humanitarian crisis right now. The black people in Chicago are bleeding on the streets.
These resources that have not come to us, now you want to overly compensate for people who never lived here before, and we need to be taken care of first and foremost before anything else happens here.
Why would any leader put our black communities already riddled with crime at further risk by placing unvetted non-taxpayers steps away from our seniors, our children, and our homes we've worked so hard on our own to secure?
We are at war, people. Our communities are at war. They are violating our communities, and we asking that we across the country, and we asking and we're demanding for office of Black America, or whatever you want to call it, to deal with issues like this.
That's right, that's right.
I did get placed on a wait list, but I was told that the immigrants were taking priority. See, that's a story that a lot of people don't know, and it hurt me. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I understand we need to be humanitarian, but these people my participants are third and fourth generation Chicagoans. Born, bred, fed, and raised here. My grandmother, Mayrella Carrington, rest in peace, always said, Craig, charity starts at home first, and then it go abroad.
Politically, having over 500 people in our community would completely wipe out any interest we have.
Many of these migrants have been dumped in our neighborhoods without a plan in place to monitor and house them long term.
They're fed up. They already see the problems that they're having, managing the Americans that are there now, that are there today. They feel it every day. Their streets are unsafe. Their schools have failed. And so they're getting extraordinarily upset. I want you to think of a nation state, a country, as if it's a family, right? So we have a family, and my family, I'm going to provide for my family first, right? Take care of my children, try and keep them safe, raise them to be decent human beings, and financially, I'm going to be supporting them. I'm not going to sit there and put myself in a financial debt hole to support my neighbor and their children. That doesn't make too much sense, right? And it's not that I don't care about my neighbors. Some of them are great people. They're wonderful people. But again, my first primary obligation is to take care of my children, to make sure that they're fed, to make sure that they're housed, to make sure that they have clothes, to make sure that they're safe. Try and protect them as best I can. That's my job as a father. The same holds true for the country. You have to take care internally of the people, the ones that you're supposed to be beholden to. It's not the other way. See, that's where we went wrong, right? So the officials, they believe that the people exist to serve them. But the truth of the matter is they exist to serve us. And we have to take care of our people. We have to take care of our communities. We can't stretch and destroy the communities that are already struggling. Here's another clip of the people being outraged. Take a listen.
Inside South Shore International College Prep.
Excuse me, a question was asked.
Hundreds of residents gathered to hear from city leaders on a plan to move migrants to the old South Shore High School.
I think what's important is that we really establish that this is a humanitarian crisis, and we're here. You're not supposed to interrupt. You're not supposed to interrupt.
Members of Mayor Lightfoot's administration were supposed to give a presentation, but were interrupted by angry outbursts. and decided to move directly to residents' questions. One being how many asylum seekers would be housed here.
We were looking at a potential phased approach utilizing the first floor first only. What that means, you can fit up to, we'd start with 250, 500.
I'm ticked off. You're doing this wrong. You're doing it wrong. 250 people? Give me a break.
We have several home-based daycares. Who are they? Who are we going to be dealing with? I'm directly across the street. I have to fear for the children that I care for.
I think it would be very fair for every homeless immigrant that you bring in, that you scoop up one of the homeless individuals in our community. I think that would be fair. And that you also provide that bed, that shower, that meal.
But this is why Republicans annoy me, right? Because at the two clips that I just played of Chicago residents being outraged, where were the Republicans? I mean, not for nothing. They should have been at those press conferences. They should have been standing side by side with those people in those communities, fighting for them, listening to them in those communities, asking them what their biggest concerns are and how they can help. What should be the policy priorities for these communities? That's what Republicans should be doing. If you want to win over voters, you actually have to speak to them. You have to go to these communities. And the Republicans do a miserable job of this. They ignored these areas for decades. And I understand it. Time, money, resources, they're all limited. I get that. But at the same time, you're not going to win over any votes if you don't reach out to them, if you don't talk to them, if you just ignore them and their problems. And that's what the Republicans have been doing for too long. If Republicans went into these communities at this point, given all the failures that exist, given how these communities have changed, given how much worse off the people's lives are in these communities, if you start drawing off 10, 15, 20% of those voters to support you, you win the election. You will win the popular vote. You will win the electoral college. I mean, that's it doesn't take a genius to figure out politics. Politics is pretty common sense. And yet Republicans aren't doing it. It is truly mind-boggling. Where are they? So they're just as guilty as the Democrats. They're all frauds. That's what it comes down to. They don't care about the people. They care about their positions. They care about being party bosses. They care about maintaining their influence within the political party. They're not trying to broaden out the base. They're not trying to reach across and bring these people over. They're not trying any of that. Now, some of you will say, well, you get what you vote for, right? And yes, that is true. We're ultimately responsible in the end. We are ultimately responsible. So take a place like Chicago. They just voted out Lori Lightfoot. They don't like her. She's been a horrible mayor, one of the worst mayors in the entire country. And what did they do? Well, they elected a far left radical, even left to Lori Lightfoot, which I didn't even know was even possible, but apparently it is. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that, 30% of the voting age population actually turned out to vote, somewhere around that number? Again, it shows what would happen if Republicans went in these areas and gave the people something to vote for. The majority of people aren't voting because they have nothing to vote for. So if you want to win the elections, you've got to go into these communities. And this immigration issue, this is going to be one of the major issues of 2024. And interestingly enough, this is why Trump won in 2016. You know, this is how dumb Democrats are. They despise Trump so much, yet they're giving him the ammunition he needs to run for 2024. It's amazing because I will guarantee you that that's going to be the winning issue. It is too overwhelming what we're seeing. The floodgates are open. The assimilation process cannot sustain. You cannot have an assimilation process when you have over 10,000 people crossing over illegally day in, day out, where court dates are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 years down the road. It's not going to work. And this doesn't even include all those that have overstayed their visa. These politicians need to be reminded, these officials need to be reminded that they are there to serve us, not the other way around, that they have an obligation to the American people first, particularly our veterans who have sacrificed so much. We used to have politicians that actually appreciated the people. Not anymore. They view the people as part of a peasant class. They'll sit there and they'll feign outrage and they'll claim they care about the people. But ask yourself, doesn't matter what political side you're on, ask yourself, what have they done to improve your life, your community? What have they done? They haven't done much, right? Still debating many of the same issues that we have been for the last 50, 60, 70 years. They all promise to solve the problems. Government's gotten bigger and bigger. It's gotten more powerful. And yet the problems are worse than ever. You think it's time to start thinking about that? You think maybe we need to go back, preach personal responsibility, limited government, providing the citizens of this country the tools that if they use them right and they work hard, that they could achieve, that they won't have to become reliant on government. They won't need government to provide for them, meaning the American taxpayer. They'll be independent, financially secure. I think that would go a long way. So maybe, if we actually hold officials responsible, we could get a handle on this. Unfortunately, as I always say, the solutions are not that complex. The question is there the will to do it? Is there a will to say what needs to be said? And sadly, too many of our politicians fail. Well, it's time we hold them accountable. It's time we hold the bureaucracy accountable. It's time that people that we put in office do their damn jobs. Take care of the American people. Take care of the country first before we start opening the floodgates. Now, if you found the content of this episode informative, please give the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating, take 30 seconds to write a review, and share it with your family, friends, and on social media. I want to thank you for joining me. I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.